Hi, everyone. Caroline Smith, and I'm going to be going over a story map that I made, and it's kind of going to double as a presentation as well. So, the first thing that we're going to jump into is the importance of slave narratives. But first, what is a slave narrative? A slave narrative is going to be an autobiography and or a memoir. Essentially, it is describing the first-hand life experience of a person who was enslaved or who knew of somebody in their immediate life who was a slave. Why are slave narratives important? First, we need to look at the importance of slave labor to the United States. Slavery during this time was able to thrive because of the westward expansion and the vital need for slave labor and cotton production in the South. The southern United States was a perfect place to set up cotton production. It had the right weather, the right soil, the right amount of land opportunities, and plantation owners had access to the cheapest form of labor, enslaved labor. It can be seen in the violence that was enacted by the southern plantation owners by a governmental intervention on their behalf in order for the expansion of cotton production and cotton profit to be expanded. This information is relevant to the discussion of slave narratives for this project because it sets up the economic scene in the United States, and it also shows that what the social atmosphere would have been set up as for enslaved people. Since enslaved people were the ones who were being exploited and abused for their labor in order for slave owners to turn over profit in the cotton production industry, this would have been valuable information to paint the scene that many enslaved people would have to live with, as well as what they were attempting to flee from and have eradicated in the United States. When we are looking at slave narratives, we are looking at the life experiences and first-hand perspectives of the people who were most impacted by slavery in the United States. Thus, it gives the harsh realities of enslavement as we know it today. With these narratives, we are able to engage with the emotional responses that these narratives were meant to convey to the audiences. Much of what these narratives were meant to be used for was the progression of the abolitionist movement. These narratives would be funded by abolitionists, and those who were writing narratives about their experiences were encouraged to do so and to have their work published by abolitionists and edited by abolitionists. Because these narratives were written to invoke powerful emotions by exposing the reader to the horrors that enslaved people often were subjected to, it was a powerful tool to get the masses on the side of abolitionists, or at least against enslavement in the United States. So, the first instance of a slave narrative that we're going to look at is Harriet Jacobs. For this class, we read about Jacobs and we were able to read snippets of her narrative. So, in summary of what we learned about Jacobs, she was born into slavery in Edenton, North Carolina. From a very young age, she was pursued by her enslaver and sexually harassed and assaulted by him. She would have children by him but continued to resist his advances. This was one of the most notable aspects of her work. She was very blatant in describing the sexual acts that were forced onto her by a white man that was typically taboo to really discuss publicly. With a threat to herself and her children by her enslaver, she would go into hiding for 7 years in her grandmother's crawl space in the attic. She would eventually escape enslavement and find her way to New York, where she would begin to tell her experiences. Now, this is going to be a new face. This is Drumgold. The first person that we are going. Kate Drumgold was born into slavery in 1858 in Virginia. One of the experiences that she talks about in her narrative is the selling of her mother when she was a young girl. Her mother was sold to a poor white man as collateral so that man could take the place of her enslaver in the Civil War. To quote her narrative, "We did not know that she was sold until she was gone, and the saddest thought was to me to know which way she had gone, and I used to go outside and look up to see if there was anything that would direct me." End quote. At the end of the Civil War, after emancipation, she would reunite with her mother, and the two of them would flee to New York. She would then focus on getting her education, which was she was an avid believer in for women and for African Americans. Now we're going to discuss the importance of women's narratives in this aspect. So, women in history tend to get put on the back burner, especially women of color. This is true about enslaved women as well. As we have seen with Jacob's narrative, there are a couple of things that can be pulled out of it that are very important for women narratives coming out of enslavement. The first thing to look at is the ways in which women were treated. Sexual harassment and the assaults of enslaved women was one of the strongest aspects of Jacob's narrative. It was a taboo for women and enslaved women to talk about the abuses that they face so blatantly as Jacob's did. But it was an important aspect to tell, and as well as we all know, in history it was a common occurrence. Another aspect of Jacob's narrative that is important to talk about as it relates to women narratives is the relation to motherhood and family. While male narratives do discuss and talk about family, the aspects of motherhood are very important for women during this time. For women, motherhood was a very important aspect of defining yourself as a woman. It was a job taken very seriously by many. And for enslaved women, losing children was also a common occurrence because they could be taken in an instant and sold to somebody else. The focus on the children in her narrative was also something that would elicit emotion and sympathy from the readers. Then looking at Drumgold's narrative, there was also important things to take away from it. While this is true for men as well, in the instance where her mother is sold as collateral, this is an instance of women being used as commodities to be bought and sold and put in place of other things. It demonstrates the monetary value that they had, not particularly their individual value as human beings. The next person that we're going to look at should be a familiar face. This is Frederick Douglass, who we have also looked at in class. For this class, we were able to read a snippet from Frederick Douglass's narrative previously, so I won't get too into the details, but I will give a very, very brief summary of who he is and the importance of his narrative. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery in the earlier parts of the 19th century in Maryland. Frederick Douglass is one of the most well-known abolitionists, and his narratives and other works were very well read from this period, as we've seen. Moving on to a more likely unfamiliar face is Henry Bibb. Henry Bibb was born into slavery in Kentucky. His father was a senator and his mother was an enslaved woman. He attempted escapes many times throughout his life and faced a number of betrayals and atrocities as an enslaved man. In his first initial escape, he fled without his wife and his child. He did eventually try and return in order to help them flee as well, but he was caught in the act. He would attempt this a couple of other times, in which he would also be sent to a slave prison, where he eventually would meet up with his wife and child again. He managed to get them all sold to the same enslaver, but they lived in a terrible, abusive conditions there, and he was eventually separated from his wife and child. He would later flee to Canada and become an avid part of abolition on his own. So, how were these narratives and their ideologies received? It depended. In some instances, narratives were very supported. For example, Frederick Douglass was supported by abolitionists, and many of the narratives that we have looked at thus far, and many more, were also supported by abolitionists in their creation. This was done in order to promote their cause and to gain sympathy from those who were either on the fence about slavery or who were pro-slavery. In Douglass's case, there were many people who appreciated his writing, but they didn't appreciate how he wrote about the institution of slavery and his bitterness towards the institution of slavery. But the rise in popularity of slave narratives did particularly come from the fact that they played at people's emotions for at least the contemporary readers of the time. In some instances, slave narratives were not taken seriously. This was true of Harriet Jacobs' narrative. People were incredulous to believe that a woman could face the assaults that she did repeatedly, or that she could have survived in a crawl space without leaving for 7 years without anyone knowing until after the fact. But some debate often goes into the validity of the narratives even still today. When working with narratives in the historical field, it is usually important to pair them with other primary sources that can validate the information in the narrative. Leaning in again into the how the ideology aspect is received, we can look at the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which I believe we also discussed in class. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was an important talking point for abolitionists. These slave narratives were tools to attempt to abolish slavery in the United States, but they faced a lot of different obstacles. As mentioned previously, expansion and cotton production were huge parts of the economy and the control that Southern planters had on the government. So, with these new territories on the market, pro slavery and abolitionists were fighting over which of these the states would end up being. What ended up happening was that it would be left up to a vote for those who moved into those new states. How this relates to slave narratives is that this was one of the things that abolitionists were trying to prevent by talking about the horrors and inhumanity of slavery. But these laws were not full stopping slavery's expansion. It also relates to key players who gained notoriety from their narratives, in other words, particularly Frederick Douglass, who was very vocal in newspapers such as the New York Times on these new territories being excluded from the expansion of slavery. And finally, we've reached the conclusion of the project. Things to take away from this topic of slave narratives as it relates to this course would be those who were in abolitionist circles and who were writing or producing these narratives lived knowing that the world they were living in did not respect or represent them. Slavery, and even after emancipation, the rights of a huge demographic of people in the United States were not cared about or acknowledged. In this course, we have talked about the idea of the more perfect union. But to those who were enslaved and who were writing about their experiences within slavery in the United States, they knew that it was far from perfect. Their writing was actively calling out the imperfections of the society they lived in and called for change and reforms. These narratives were meant to elicit emotion and bring to the attention of people the horrors that they faced in enslavement, where they had no freedom in the country that prioritizes freedom. Essentially, they called out the hypocrisy of it all and laid the groundwork for change in the future. Thank you guys for listening to my presentation. I really hope you enjoyed it.